It's hard to believe another week is upon us, and I'm glad you're able to join us for this word of encouragement. The Lord is definitely working in churches. It's been encouraging to hear God's blessing in a number of churches, and yet I know many are struggling too with getting folks back and still all of the things that we have to navigate. And I do want to encourage you to pray for our brethren in many different places, many different scenarios, that God will definitely turn all of this to good. We are seeing things that really concern us, especially in the political realm right now, but God is able to work, and we need to pray and do what we ought to do. And keeping that in mind, I can't help but think of Daniel chapter 1. You talk about a bad situation. Jerusalem had been conquered, the temple destroyed, the city destroyed, and Daniel and his friends earlier had been brought to Babylon. We're now in a heathen environment, right at the very seat of Satan's power, and yet God blessed these young men because they had been trained right, and they had a love for God. There was definitely some connection through King Josiah and those connections with him that these men had been trained. And as they took their stand, we're very familiar with that Daniel purposed in his heart there in verse 8 that he wouldn't defile himself. And as they asked the leaders there to make provision so they could serve their God, we find in verse 17, I think this is so instructive, as for these four children, that's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. God gave them. You see, if we look at the circumstances from a human standpoint, it's very easy for us to just be overwhelmed. We feel so weak, and we are. We're insignificant, and we are. You take conservative Christianity, it's not taken very seriously today, or it's reacted to one way or the other. But that doesn't matter to God. This couldn't have been more of an overwhelming situation. And yet, God gave these four men unusual favor because they would not back down. They were going to believe God. They were going to do what's right. They weren't going to capitulate because of the pressure. And we find as you go through to the next chapter, chapter 2, that God begins to show great favor through the interpretation of the dream there in chapter 2. And then again, great favor because of the courage of the three young men that wouldn't bow and had to go to the fiery furnace. And then chapter 4, where God causes the mind of Nebuchadnezzar to be brought into really an insane position. And for 7 years, Daniel, this young man, ruled the empire on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar. That's what God can do. We could never figure that kind of thing out. We could never figure that Mordecai, later in the Medo-Persian Empire, he would be the prime minister. Who would have thought it? Or Nehemiah could have the power he had in the Persian Empire. God can work through the lives of those that trust him. And so, friends, let's keep our eye on God. Let's don't keep our eyes on ourselves or our situation. If we'll do right, and if we will not back down in these days, I think we're going to see things that will be amazing because God has a great work that he wants to do. May God help us really believe that with all of our heart.